No exaggeration. Chill out. Maybe this scout was really tired of work. David stood up for the lazy scout. An old man would be tired rather than a young man like this, the 10-year-old boy replied, pointing to a figure in a cave spread out on a mattress in such a way that his feet touched his buttocks. Look what shit mess he left on the table, the boy said again, this time pointing to a wooden table full of crumbs and stains probably caused by some spilled drink. After a while, TWOU spoke again, or rather shrieked. What is it? Fortunately, he did not wake up the scout. Look, he pointed his finger on the sleeper's head. David strained his eyes because of the twilight inside. When the boy accustomed his eyes to the darkness, he guessed what TWOU meant. Next to the lazy nose lay 2 dirty socks. David had to plug his mouth so as not to laugh. Let's get out of here. I can't look at it anymore, TWOU said to the others. Right, let's hurry up a bit. Poppin nodded. The team, guided by Poppin, came out of the gorge. Descending from the mountain turned out to be more difficult than climbing, but at least it did not cost as much effort. The team just had to be careful not to slide down the sharp rocks and the sliding gravel. Fortunately, after a while, the wanderers found themselves in a dense forest, and soft moss and grass appeared under their feet. After a while, the team ventured deeper into the forest, avoiding the place where the scouts caught another team in front of their eyes. Suddenly, the pleasant silence was broken by David. And anyway, how old are you, Nathan? Nathan sighed and replied quietly. Almost 20, you could say that I am already so old, and why do you ask? Nothing, and so I ask and think about how you can live as long as Poppin, for example. Just, remind me exactly how old you are, Poppin, the halfling replied with a smile. Exactly 362 years, buddy. That's stupid, sick, illogical. Nathan is 19 years old and his appearance indicates it, and you are 362, although you don't look so old at all. Where did I end up? Even in my dreams, expectations and imagination, I have not seen or heard such nonsense, because it so happens that I often dream stupid dreams, but it's just, this nonsense has knocked me down. Can you not speak for a moment and do not yell out? Nathan got angry about David. If I am about 300 years old, I look like I'm 32. When I am 500 years old, I'll look like I'm 50, understand? In this world, you just live 10 times longer, or at least 6 times longer, because I have already told you that few today are so old, Poppin replied to David. 600 is a very small number, yes, so be it. You will live for these 6 centuries and I will not live to see even one, or maybe you will live to be maybe 900 years old, and I will only be 90? What is this supposed to mean at all? Why? Apparently the people of your world wanted to destroy themselves, don't you think, friend? In addition, there must be something behind all this. It must definitely be someone bad. Who is supposed to? What's going on? The curious boy asked. An craved and mysterious ruler of your world, Poppin satisfied David's curiosity. Who is that? Did you want to say a false ruler? David asked a little more seriously. Yes, the halfling replied briefly. But who is he? Some new incarnation of Adolf Hitler, laughed the boy, but after a while realized that it is not entirely funny. Besides, the halfling looked like he had never heard of a cruel German dictator. Nanthornin should probably explain it all to you. After all, he is supposedly a person who has access to all worlds, Poppin replied quickly. Everyone listened to David's conversation with Poppin with obvious curiosity. Well, not exactly, because Pago had the same facial expression all the time as he always had. He was gloomy and looked like he was sad or broken all the time. Okay, I'm not just speaking anymore, and so I do not grasp anything that is happening here. It's just that my head can't keep up with thinking and that's it. But unfortunately, it seems that this is not a dream, and I wanted it to be just my dreams because I feel like I have a decent schizophrenia. You don't even know, Poppin, how I felt on the first day here when I was kidnapped. I thought I was over the hump, but I never snorted anything. Now I only hope that I will not meet something even more on my way, mythological than all that thing, David said, pulling off his hood and grabbing his forehead. He had the impression that his brain was about to burst with all these thoughts and watching these uncreative things, but as he watched this mysterious world for a long time, it became more and more real to him. Please, don't tell me about these mythologies anymore, because I am about to go crazy. I don't want to watch this fairy tale anymore. The boy broke down, shaking hands by the forehead. He closed his eyes and immediately regretted it, because after a while he stumbled and went down the ground a few meters down. When David was getting up from the ground, he saw something beside him in the grass. "Oh, look, Arrow," the boy guessed quickly. "Hide!" shouted Poppin suddenly, but not too loudly. David immediately figured out what was going on. About 15 meters in front of them, they saw the outline of a man barely visible because of shrubs and other understorments. David moved bent towards the thick tree and hid behind it. He bowed his head and saw a figure approaching him. Without a doubt, it was a scout. "Did he notice me?" The boy was worried. The man came dangerously close to the tree behind which David was searching, but the scout paid no attention to the tree, only something else. The person bowed down and pulled the arrow out of the ground, putting it in a quiver. When she did, she turned violently backwards, for someone's voice had just spoken. "What are you doing?" said Rin. "Do you play and shoot mindlessly at the trees instead of doing the work I'm looking for and having fun by the way?" the scout excused. "Then stop playing like a child, or you're going to shoot someone," shouted the voice of the other scout. "Yes sir. I'm already looking," the scout replied automatically, directing his gaze to the ground. When he did, he crouched down and began to look closely at the forest litter. "Hey, here are someone's shoe prints." "Certainly not mine," shouted suddenly the tracker and added after a while they lead towards these trees. "Well, check it out, you stupid kiddo," shouted the second voice. David was terrified. The scout began to walk towards him with a quick step. David's heart went to David's throat. He felt like he was in a horror movie when he saw a shady figure walking exactly in his direction. The boy, however, managed to quickly shake off and jumped into the bushes. Fortunately, he did not forget to cover his eyes with his hands. David will literally drown in sharp branches. David's body was additionally covered by a cape of leaves and branches. The scout followed the tracks until they suddenly disappeared. He looked around but found nothing. The reason for the lack of traces was that David jumped in, not went to the bushes. The scout, however, did not know this. After a while, however, he turned his attention to the bushes next door, where David was sitting crouched. He walked a few steps towards the unders, but immediately stopped. The scout heard a strange sound coming from above, so he looked there and saw something terrifying. Something was falling directly from the branches of the trees on him. The victim did not even have time to scream, because after a while a tree bough hit her head, depriving him of consciousness. The tracker fell to the ground like a chopped tree. The boy slowly came out of the sharp branches and saw a man lying down. He looked up and saw Turhin on a tree with an axe in his hand. David immediately guessed what the boy had done. "Thanks," the 13-year-old said in relief to Turhin, then looked back stunned at the lying scout. Chapter 7. The team came out of the forest. It was in the place where they had previously found Cordrin. For a long time, Nathan was the first to speak. "What if people will see that there are 6 of us but not 5? Everyone halts. "We will convince the law that Cordrin is my friend and did not help us much," Poppin replied calmly. Nathan nodded his head unsteadily and decided not to speak again, because they were again on the cliffs. This time it was easier to go down than to enter. By the collapse of the earth, a kind of earth slide was created, which allowed the team to safely go down. After a while, they saw the high observation tower again. Again, the sneaking between hundreds of boulders began. Suddenly, David spoke as they were behind one of the large stones. "And what about this scout? Maybe he got some kind of concussion. You just put a bandage on his head with some liquid. He could saw us before he got hit and he will tell what we did. Don't worry buddy. Such a branch should not do anything serious with his head. He might have even thought that the bough had broken down on its own." Turhin knew what he was doing. He reassured Poppin. David nodded his head, nodding barely visibly. After less than an hour, the team again saw the same commander with a notebook in his hand, whom they met first. When the man saw them, he wrote something down in his notebook a second time. As they went further, they had only one more stone wall to overcome, from which they had to descend. The team went down the rope, ran quickly through the forest and finally saw the camp. The comrades ran there in a frantic run and she entered the white finish line. It was only when they did this that David felt how tired he was, so when they sat down on the bench to rest, the Lord approached them and asked them, "Where did you get this halfling from? I don't think I've ever seen it. There were to be 5 of you, I'm right? He is a good friend of mine. We found ourselves in quite ridiculous circumstances. He could accompany us during the mission, Papin replied calmly as usual. The problem is that it is not yet known whether you have won. Scouts will tell you if they saw you or not. You are the first to do so. It is true that you were the first to move, but you were also the first to come back. Lord Hendren straightened up and stroked his hair. Suddenly, someone's voice said, "But my lord, there are 6 of them, they should be disqualified right away." The person who said these words was Metkel, the man who made fun of David's team at first. "Yes, there are 6 of them, but my trusted cook Popin is Pop-Tollid, and you should know this saying, the word of Pop-Tollid is more valuable than the throne of the king himself." Hendren stood up for the team. "Yes sir," Metkel agreed, with an embarrassed expression. After a while, the long-haired soldier looked angrily at the team, bowed slightly to the lord and walked towards the barracks that were at the back of the large orange tent. When Metkel disappeared from the team's sight, there was an uproar among the crowd next to them. David and the others saw the second team coming back. However, she was not in a hurry. When it entered the great camp, David recognized the defeat. They saw with their own eyes how the scouts found them while they were in the forest. There was no indication that this team was overwhelmed by its stupid defeat. Apparently, they didn't really care about winning and took part in the competition just to pass the time. That's what David thought. The Lord was still standing next to the bench on which he was sitting. Teenager, so Nathan decided to ask Hendren something. "How many teams participate in the competition, Lord?" "Exactly 20 teams, my friend," Lord replied. The word friend uttered by the Lord was further proof that Hendren liked and respected his servant Nathan. David had already taken a liking to the growing Lord. Hendren even gave him a dagger and a belt just like that. After a while, the Lord left and disappeared into the crowd. Suddenly, the third team arrived at the finish line. Soon after, the fourth and fifth. After a dozen or so minutes were all there. When the last one arrived, the sun was already setting. "What time is it?" David asked, but he thought that unfortunately no one here has a watch. Papin looked up at the sky, raised his hand up and calculated the time with his fingers. "It's an hour around 19th and 10. How do you know that?" David asked in amazed. "I know it by the position, color and place where the sun is. This is also indicated by the color of the clouds and the length of the shadows. It also depends on the month, because as you probably know, each month the sunsets are at different times." When David heard this, he realized that it was logical, but suddenly his peace was disturbed by the voice of the horn. The boy jumped to his feet and lined up with the others in front of the Lord's large tent. After a while, Lord Hendren, Nanthornin, Turgeon and Serema, the commander of archers and scouts in the camp, came out of the interior. Serema looked similar to other scouts, except that he was wearing leather armor and the sword at his side. Scouts had knives and bows. He also had these tools, so much better. "Attention, Master Serema will announce to you who is the winner of the competition," cried Hendren in a loud voice so that everyone could hear him. The master of the bow stepped forward, saluting the ruler of the camp, then turned towards the crowd and began to read something from the list. Team 1, that is, as Lord said, a team of some, David, and team number 6 led by Sitelhav were unnoticed by my scouts. However, the winning team must be only one, so the team wins, David, because of the best time result of all. In addition, all of the commanders found evidence of their honesty in the competition. Hearing this, David wanted to sink underground. He still didn't know why they were using his name for the team name. Lord even said at the beginning that he would start as the first team of David. His thoughts, however, were disturbed by the joy of his friends, who began to rejoice in their win by shouting and laughing. Of course, it will not be without training. The winning team must be prepared for combat and the art of camouflage, and, of course, the great Nanthornin will set off with the winning team. Hendren turned again to the crowd. David looked in the direction of Nanthornin, who was standing next to Turgeon, his friend. The giant looked the boy in the eye and smiled. The boy was thrilled with the thought that he would probably be accompanied by a being from behind the worlds. Hendren didn't even know it, but David found it out more than once. For example, the fact that Nanthornin took him to this world in a supernatural way gave the boy a lot to think about. The boy was already beginning to be afraid of all this. Hendren returned to his tent and Serema followed him, as the guards were already pulling the curtains apart from the entrance to the tent to let the Lord and the scout out of the crowd. Someone's voice said, "Please wait, I have something to say, something that will be of particular interest to Master Serema." The master of the bow turned towards the crowd. He had the impression that he could hear a very young voice. He looked down a little and saw a boy emerging from the crowd. All the people around them moved away so that the scout could see TWOU clearly. "What do you want, kiddo?" Sarima asked in a somewhat stern voice. "I would like to report the laziness and failure to fulfill the duties of one of your people, master." Everyone in the crowd began to listen with curiosity to hear what the young man had to say. "How's that? All my people are excellent and fulfill their duties, unless, how do I will kick him into this pooper." The master suddenly became angry. At first TWOU thought that Sarima meant him and that for unknown reasons he wanted to kick him in, but after a while the master came up to him and said, "Lead me to him, lead me to this naughty cockroach boy." TWOU bowed and began to lead Sarima towards Mount of Natha. TWOU's friends also followed them. All the inhabitants of the camp looked at this scene without understanding anything, but everyone knew that something really uninteresting was being prepared. Behind the team and the scout, one armed man hurriedly moved as a small escort. This time, the team did not have to sneak around, and Sarima showed them a hidden staircase to the top of the stone wall. If only we had known about this passage before, a heartbroken David thought. After a few as they were not far from the ravine, and David was going further and he did not know why he had gone with the others. He could already rest in a tent and the sky has already become quite dark. When they were at the gorge, the entrance was barely visible. TWOU pulled the creepers apart and led Sarima in front. When they had already overcome 100 meters of the gorge, a small cave could be seen below, from which a pale light was coming, probably from some lamp. TWOU pointed a scout to the entrance to the cave. Sarima jumped in an agile motion and saw something that made him very angry. On a huge message lay a scout who did not fulfill his duties. The room was illuminated by a small lamp on the table. "It's outrageous, it's not good," the master hissed. Sarima approached the sleeping lazy man. The others watched, expecting what would happen. Suddenly, the other one kicked the scout with all his might. Sleepy immediately woke up and saw Sarima's dark face shaded by a hood. It's a monster," yelled the terrified young scout. These words did not make any impression on Sarima. The master of the bow reached for his bow, leaned it against the ground and quickly pulled off the bowstring. David didn't know at first what Sarima wanted to do, but after a while he found out. The scout began to beat the victim with a heavy, well-waxed bowstring literally like a whip straight into the unfortunate man's ass. The lazy began to nap. When the bowstring pierced the air and folded, the sleeper slightly in the buttock apparently felt a little relief from the fact that he did not get something thicker and heavier, but not for long. The air pierced the sound again, but this one was slightly different from the previous one. A moment earlier, Sarima had reached for his leather belt, and dissatisfied with the effects of the previous salvo, slammed with all his strength into the back of the body of the still, briefly happy young scout. Sleepy immediately turned pale when he learned that this was not the end. In the eyes of the armed man who came with the team and Sarima there was an expression of horror. Papin wanted to speak, but decided to remain silent. He decided that it would be best not to instruct the master of the bow how to punish the lazy in a less brutal way. Sarima got bored of whipping the scout only after a dozen or so volleys. "Pity, mercy on me," the lazy man continued to tear himself, expecting another blow. The master of the bow, however, finally stopped whining the poor scout and turned to the gathering. "This lazy has been driving me crazy for a long time. It brings shame on me." "Then why don't you fire him? He is not suitable for any work." TWOU turned to the master. "Exactly, he is not suitable for any job and that's what it's all about. His father asked me to hire him and mobilize him, but as you can see, nothing reaches this snot," shouted the scout, kicking finally battered in the ass. When the soldier next to him saw what had happened to the scout's buttocks, he promised himself to fulfill his duties to the end of his service. He did not want the same thing to happen to him, although he doubted that he would be able to do so, and certainly Lord wouldn't have done it with his own hands. The scout howled and howled in pain. "That little snot, Celian," said the scout again, showing him crying lazy man, "deserved to be spanked." The archer finished. "Take a good look at him. This is what the picture of misery and despair looks like." Sarima continued, taking the hood off Celian's sleeper's head and slamming him on the cheek. Now David could take a closer look at the lazy. Celian could not have been much older than Nethin, so to his eye he looked like he was about 19 or 20 years old. His hair was short and black, and his eyes were strange in color as if they were half green and half blue. In addition, the scout was very slim, but very tall. The terrified young man looked at the belt of the scout commander. He was relieved to say that the wing was over for today. Maybe you and Nan Thorning, you will mobilize this loser as you go on a mission. Do a favor for me, I ask you politely. He will accompany you on your journey. Of course, this fool will not enter the king's city with you, because he will certainly bring you some trouble, said Serima to the team, and after a while he said to Celian. And you should be ashamed. This team found you and you didn't find them. You're just lazy. You don't deserve to be called a scout. At least I will have peace of mind when these noble victors and Nan Thornin take you away from me and teach you anything. Yes, I'm so sorry, Jay. Just don't beat, shouted Celian to the master. Okay, slob, because you'll cry again. And now you are going with us to the camp. You will be chopping firewood as a punishment, and forget about sleeping in the tent. And so you've slept long enough, 20 hours a day. What am I saying? You sleep 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We can see how you function. Your life is one big sleepwalking. The scout broke out on the lazy man. After a while, the master of the bow jerked the lazy scout and put on his feet. Celian hissed in pain. Serima signaled with his hand to the team and the arm to go outside. As they climbed one by one to the exit, Celian was left at the very end, who struggled to take every step, so the merciful soldier helped him enter. Now poor Celian was entering the camp for a long and painful journey. The wanderers headed south and began to walk towards the camp. For a scout with a sore butt, this long walk was a real nightmare, and he never even let go of the fact that something so terrible would happen to him in his life. Chapter 8. Celian worked outside all night. He was forced to chop wood, light all the fires, and clean the kitchen in Lord's tent. When the exhausted scout finished his work, the sun was already rising. Lord Hendron, sleeping in his tent, heard whining coming from the kitchen all night. When David got up in the morning and left the tent, he saw Nan Thornin by the large fire, who was covering Celian lying on the ground tightly with a blanket. The exhausted unfortunate man had been sleeping on the wet grass only for several minutes. When Nan Thornin finished covering him tightly with a blanket, he turned towards the 13-year-old and approached him. David was almost half the size of the warrior. The eyes of the giant of bluish diamond color began to stare at the boy. David had long lacked the courage to speak to Nan Thornin. "Hi," the boy finally said. "Good morning," replied the giant, which sentence David did not like especially. The boy had not heard Nan Thornin's voice for quite a long time, which did not quite fit him. The menacing-looking warrior had a voice usually quiet, drawn out and cheerful, in addition soothing to the ear. After a while, the gentle voice of the giant spoke again. "Apparently we are to train martial art before the mission." "Yes." David only nodded affirmatively. "Can you practice with me?" David hesitated. "How?" he asked. "I'll give you my sword and you'll try to hit me." David swallowed his saliva when he saw Nan Thornin pull the sword from behind his back. David realized that the sword was fortunately short, but after a while he realized that this weapon was small only in the hand of a giant. In fact, this sword for David was enormous. Nan Thornin grabbed the blade of the weapon and stretched his hand forward so that the boy could grab the sword by the hilt. The slim boy hesitated again. He thought that when he took the sword in his hands, he would not hold it and they would detach themselves from him. However, after a while he dared to take the sword. He carefully grabbed the orange handle, so Nan Thornin let go of his gun. David expected that right now he could not bear the weight of the great weapon, but nothing of the kind happened. The sword turned out to be literally light, almost like a feather. Amused, David looked at the tool. Only now he noticed that the sword was as thin as paper. "What?" yelled excited David. The boy thought to himself at that moment that Nan Thornin was joking about him, and when he will hit something with this sword, the whole weapon literally splashes into pieces. The giant then gave David a hand sign to attack him. The boy waved his sword lightly at Nan Thornin. "Can't afford for something more?" asked the giant. David answered nothing but suddenly began to wash his sword like a man. Nan Thornin avoided or parried blows with an iron bracelet on his right hand. From a distance, it looked as if Nan Thornin was deflected blows with his bare fist, the more so because the bracelet was covered with a white sleeve. From afar, everything was watched by Metcalf, who was leaning his back against the wooden wall of a small building in which there was a toilet. After a while, the armed man moved towards the practicing people. "Your apprentice is quite good at wielding a sword," Metcalf said to Nan Thornin suddenly. Of course, for this age, the warrior, with light, long hair, finished after a while. But me, I didn't have a sword in my hand at all, David replied uncertainly. Only now I have, the boy finished after a moment of reflection. Why don't we practice together in the barracks? Asked Metcalf quietly. David was a little surprised. That warrior who had previously mocked him and the rest of his team has now suddenly become friendly to David. The boy after a while realized that he did not answer for a long time, so he quickly answered the soldier's question. Yes, I think so. I mean, yes, after all, this place is for this purpose. Well, you rather know, David suddenly fell silent immediately when he saw Metcalf's laughing expression. Your disciple is also a good joker. The warrior turned to Nanthonin, pretending to be David's embarrassed voice. The giant answered nothing but smiled barely visibly. Metcalf let them know by hand to follow him. After a while, all three were in the barracks consisting of several arrowslets for archers, training mannequins and, of course, a larger tent where some of the better soldiers guarding the Lord slept. The whole was surrounded by a wooden fence. The warrior opened the gate and let in the first comrades. It turned out that Turgeon was also practicing in the barracks. David approached one of the mannequins, which was made of a wooden cross on which were bags full of sand and hay. Leather armor also hung on some. Metcalf pulled out a huge sword of a strange shape from behind his back. This weapon was not simple, but as if torn. In individual places it was prominent. To David, this weapon resembled a tool for tearing rather than for chopping. After a while, the boy twitched when he saw the warrior tear the entire dummy to shreds in a few seconds. How many times do I have to tell them and beg them to finally make better and more durable mannequins? It's slowly starting to get boring. These puppets are as soft as rubber, growled Metcalf. After a while, the boy also looked to the left to see how Turgeon was doing. The slightly armed heroist just jumped up and stuck his axe straight into the top of the dummy's head. Then he jerked his weapon upwards, tearing the whole puppet out of the ground. Then he jumped up again with the mannequin impaled and they were fluttering against the ground. David bulged his eyes as he looked at both massacred mannequins. Metcalf, who had nothing to destroy, decided to eliminate the pieces of wood and shreds of bags that remained. It was only after a long while that David looked away from the torn artificial body and took care of himself. The boy swung and stuck his sword into his training artificial partner. David didn't even have to make too much effort, because the weapon itself did a great job for him. David cut the big dummy halfway. Astounded, David looked at Heroest's incredible weapon. Nanthonin had not done anything yet, but after a while he swung his bare hand at the artificial opponent. David expected to hear a roar of pain when the giant struck his hand against the thick peltry, but suddenly the boy noticed that under his white sleeve protruded three thin blades resembling long claws. The blades stuck into the dummy's head and cut it through. David nodded appreciatively when he saw an artificial head flying a few good meters. David took care of himself again, until suddenly all four of them heard someone screaming. The boy looked in the direction from where it was coming from and saw something he least expected. Serema was walking towards them, who brutally pushed poor Celian in front of him, who was screaming at the top of his lungs. "Leave me," said the terrified young scout. "We'll see the lazy one of what you've learned so far," the master of the bow will shout straight into Celian's ear. After a while, both scouts were already near the gate. Serema opened it aggressively and entered the practice field with a terrified scout. The commander pushed Celian towards the shields for archers. Celian broke free from the master's hands and approached the shooting targets closer. "Shoot, Babakri. If you don't hit at least 5 you will say goodbye to sleeping today and tomorrow, and after tomorrow. Yes, there will be no mercy," shouted like a possessed Serema. Celian clumsily pulled an arrow out of the quiver hands and dropped it unintentionally when he heard the master's scream, "Faster!" The scout quickly picked up the arrow and put it with trembling hands on the bowstring. After a while, he was already aiming towards the shield. Suddenly, Serema spoke again and began to count. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Celian immediately understood what was going on. He quickly released the arrow at the last second and looked away because he did not want to see his result. "Don't beat!" Celian shouted to the master as he heard a sound of an arrow digging into the shield. Serema, however, did not pay attention to Celian's plea, only to the shooting range. The young scout hesitantly opened his eyes slowly and saw the master's open mouth. Surprised, Celian, not knowing why Serema had such a surprised expression, turned backwards and saw something that was unbelievable. In the middle of a shield on the red point was an arrow. That's 10 points, Celian groaned, not believing, and then fell from the impression to the ground like a dead man. When Serima finally approached the scout and knocked him over on his side, he saw his face parted. At first, it seemed to Serima that the young man had really lost consciousness, but after a while a strange sound came out of Celian's gaping mouth. "Ui." The master of the bow picked up and poked Celian by the arm. From several meters, David and his 3 companions watched everything. They looked at the arrow driven straight into the center of the butt. David thought that Celian had shot the most accurately into the middle and couldn't have shot better. After a moment of David's meditation, Serima's voice interrupted. I'm pleasantly surprised. Maybe I'll let you sleep a little bit, Celian." When Celian heard this, he got up to a half-lying position and began to nod his head affirmatively, but it was more like throwing his own face. "Yes," he finally brought out a voice full of relief. When Serima heard the scout's reply, he stretched out his hands to pick him up, but Celian quickly got up and, limping through yesterday's spanking, rushed towards the white tents. After a while, Celian disappeared into one of them. "Don't you think Serima has treated Celian a little too brutally lately?" David asked his companions when he saw Celian disappear into the tent. "Yes, Serima is really weird. He is usually cheerful and friendly, but when he falls into his frenzy, he literally turns into a wild aggressive beast." Metkul answered the boy's question. "What did you say?" Suddenly some other voice growled. Metkul turned in that direction and saw the hooded master of the bow, which was a few meters away from him. "Oh, I apologize to you for offending your feelings," the warrior said in a mocking voice to the archer. On the shaded face of the master of the bow appeared an expression of anger. When Metkul saw his clenched teeth and eyes gushing with indignation, he suddenly burst out laughing like a small child. This scout was no longer able to withstand. Metkul was not laughing now. Furious, Serima threw himself at him like a wild beast and clung to the warrior's large back. Metkul, with a scout on his back, made a few turns in place, trying to regain his balance. "Rush my mount, rush," shouted the archer at the warrior, then twitched violently, depriving the mount of balance. The slim scout knocked down a growing warrior after a while. Metkul slammed against the ground with impetus, raising up a great tumble of dust that had fallen into David's eyes. When David rubbed his eyes and got rid of the irritating pinch and looked back, he saw a large crowd watching all this. Hendron, Pupin and Nethin were also among the spectators. The Lord, who was forced to stop his work due to a sudden racket, shook his head incredulously as he saw what Serima and Metkul were doing. "Such idiots," he mumbled, but no one heard those words. Of course, Nethin couldn't help but laugh, but Pupin and, of course, Lord were serious and unmoved. Nanthornin and Turgeon standing next to David also did not pay attention to this strange duel between the master of the bow and the master of the sword. Suddenly, the silence of the crowd was broken by a young voice. "Well, master, keep it up." These were undoubtedly words spoken by Turgeon, who was not yet visible among the crowd of gathered spectators. After a while, Serima came down from the body of Metkul, who was moaning in pain, and also drew attention to the crowd of people gathered from the entrance to the square. Suddenly, Serima did something that David considered idiotic. The scout began to bow slightly in front of the audience as if in a theater. The crowd, however, did not applaud, except for one person. Turgeon raised his hands up and began clapping his hands like a rage, whistling and jumping. Bago grabbed the young man's hands, preventing him from applauding. Turgeon was visibly outraged when he felt the iron embrace of his skinny, long paws. Suddenly, after a while, the Lord himself spoke with a still serious expression. "Applause. Really big applause." These words sounded as if in a mocking voice. Really, Hendron was not excited about this stupid clash, but his subordinates, hearing his words, began to slowly raise reluctant applause. Seeing this, Serima would stand with one foot on the back of the defeated man and began to send kisses to people with a gesture of his hand. Metkul was still lying on the ground, blinking his eyes quickly, as if he had just woken up from some deep sleep. He began to listen carefully to the crowd. Finally, the warrior began to rise, and as he stood on his tottering legs, he wiped off his armor and green robe the dust that was still falling down. After a long time, the dust-gray robes became dark green again. When Metkul was clean, He turned backwards to look at his rival, but when he did, he only managed to see the scout's clenched fist for a split second, and then the blurred image, and darkness. In the end, the audience only heard the voice of Metcalfe falling back to the ground. "Yi." Then he lost consciousness and Cerema triumphantly raised his hands upwards. Chapter 9. Metcalfe woke up and noticed that he is in a huge tent. When he also saw the orange curtains, he immediately realized where he is now. The fair-haired warrior was now lying on a large carpet lined with pillows and blankets in Hendron's tent. Metcalfe got up without any major problems and quickly recognized that he was now in the largest room where gold was still standing inside, a wooden model of the country's capital. Suddenly, from behind the canvas wall to his right, someone's familiar voice spoke. "When this peasant just wakes up, I'll knock him on his pretty head again." Metcalfe twitched because it wasn't long since he finally figured out who was right behind the curtain. "Calm down, Cerema. I think you know I invited you here specifically to talk to you about you and Metcalfe," said Lord's voice. What, about me and Metcalfe? This bastard has been destroying my life since I was a child. This blonde does literally anything to make my life miserable," replied the scout not very politely to his lord. "But after all, I even warned you earlier what we will talk about, so sit down calmly," said Lord. "Oh, finally you made Popin this pasta with sauce. Give us this food quickly because I am starving to death," Lord added after a while. Metcalfe dared to pull the curtain back slightly and began to eavesdrop and watch what was happening in the other room. In the kitchen at the wooden countertop sat Hendron, David, Turgeon and Cerema, while Popin was next to the stove which resembled a mock-covered bonfire, or rather a kind of stone grill. Nan Thorning was gone because he probably had more important things to do than listen to the conversations of the scout and Hendron. After a while, Popin pulled out the porcelain-colored plates from the drawer, filled them to the brim with long pasta and then poured it with some sauce that looked like tomato. The cook immediately afterwards put a dish on the table so that the guests could finally eat. When Popin again went to the oven to take meat from the scaffolding as an addition for customers, he suddenly heard the Lord's voice behind him. "P.U. Why does it taste like some soap?" Cerema had not yet swallowed the food and kept it in his mouth. When he felt this unpleasant taste, he managed to spit out food that landed straight into the pot of soup at the other end of the room. David breathed with a sigh of relief at the thought that he has not yet had time to eat anything, but when he saw two unfortunate people he felt unwell. Turgeon was also lucky, because he didn't even have time to touch a spoon. "I'm sorry, Popin, but I'm very disappointed," Lord said to the embarrassed cook. "Nope, this is impossible. Popin always makes good dishes, my lord. After all, he is the best cook we know in this area." Cerema stood up for the one-handed cook. After a while there was a longer silence. They could only hear a buzzing fly that flew right past the scout's nose. Cerema grabbed her with a lightning movement and simply crushed her in his hands. Suddenly, the long silence was finally broken by David. "Maybe not Popin but someone else spoiled this dinner." "Yes. It has to be true. I doubt that our dear Popin added to food any. Disgusting. I think only one person could have done it. A person who recently washed these plates," said the scout, pointing to strange-looking plates. As he said this, a strange smile appeared on his face. Suddenly, the smile turned into an expression of real horror and the scout broke out at the very throat. Celian, Metcalfe, who had been watching the interlocutors in the kitchen so far, turned towards the exit from the tent because he suddenly heard someone's voice coming from the other side. "I'm going." After a while, the warrior saw Celian running inside like crazy. The young scout did not pay even the slightest attention to him, so Metcalfe quickly moved so that the young man can enter the kitchen. In the eyes of the scout, he noticed a clear terror. Apparently, he knew that something bad was in the making. Celian walked in, or rather jumped into the dining room, and dropped himself to his knees in front of Cerema. The young man put his head to the ground, which looked as if he was bowing before the king himself. When Metcalfe and Hendron saw it, they bulged their eyes and parted their mouths like fish. Did the clumsy young man himself decide to do this act to greet the master, or did Cerema himself tell him to do it for a long time? The master of the bow, unlike the others, did not open his mouth, but he smiled clearly. The goofy smile did not last long, however, because after a while the scout again began to scream like a wild, rainless monkey. "Pots, what happened to the pots? They are all covered with some kind of fluid." When David heard this, he turned his attention to the dishes. Actually, He hadn't noticed it before, but now he could clearly see that they were covered with some white, dried liquid. "Do not beat," Celian shouted suddenly when he saw the angry face of the master. "You have to say immediately what happened to the bots, otherwise I will punish you to lick this filth to clean," shouted the scout. When David heard this, he wanted to vomit. The boy's face took on a greenish-pale color, but no one paid attention to it anymore. Everyone was now looking in terror at the crouched Celian, who was rocking in terror, backwards and forwards. Finally, the young man managed to cough up. "So, I washed the dishes with soap from the herb and forgot to rinse the whole thing. I'm so sorry." The last word sounded almost squeaky. Hearing this, the archer commander shook his head incredulously. "Soap from the herb? Did you want to make us sick?" "Soap from the herb. This soap brought straight from Antheria. For a few days I will not feel the taste of food because of you. You're about to regret it." Pupin, standing next to the furious scout, tried to stop him, but to everyone's horror, Serema was not going to stick around and let go. Metkul covered his mouth with his hands in horror when he saw the scout seething with anger pulling the bowstring off his bow. Lord opened his mouth to speak, but it completely clogged him. David could no longer stand all this and hit his head under the table. The terrifying silence was broken by Celian kneeling on the carpet and staring directly at the master's face with a pleading look. "Mayor, say," yelled after a while Celian. David, hearing this loud plea for mercy, bumped up in terror on his chair, banging with a bang on the thick bottom of the table with the back of his head. However, Serema still showed no mercy. He took the attack to inflict the first painful blow with a weapon he had already offered to the young scout. Celian caught his eyes tightly and tightened his muscles awaiting this painful punishment. The scout, however, did not feel a strong blow, only a slight touch on his head, literally as if the master of the bow touched it only with a thick bowstring. The assouded young man opened his eyes again and looked upwards. He saw Serema with his arch down. The master was clearly wondering about something, and there was no more wild rage in his eyes. After a while, a professional scout looked Celian straight in the face and announced, "I will not deceive you this time, although I want to punish you. I did not teach you to wash the bots after all, and when I only senselessly abuse you, I will not achieve anything and nothing will reach your empty head." Celian, hearing these words, quickly approached the compassionate Serema on his knees and hugged his legs. Tears of gratitude flowed into the young man's eyes. "Thank you," he finally said. "Sling your hook better before I will change my mind. You will learn how to wash bots at Pupin's kitchen." The master growled in response and then looked towards the veil behind which Metkul was hiding. The fair-haired warrior only after a long while finally realized that Serema saw him. "Oh, I see that someone has woken up here," the scout suddenly spoke, and then an unpleasant smile appeared on his face again. Seeing this, Metkul immediately began to act. He turned on his survival mode and ran away nimbly like an antelope from a tent. In the next morning, David got out of bed very hard. He realized that he was only in this world on the fourth day, and he felt like at home. After a while, he remembered yesterday, when the brutal Serema took pity on the clumsy Celian. His thoughts, however, were suddenly interrupted by a noise coming from outside. The boy came out of the tent and looked sideways, looking for sources of noise. Finally, the boy recognized the sound made by the swords. Probably someone practiced in the morning in the barracks, and the voice was given by weapons digging into thick puppets for training. David took in a few breaths of clean morning air and began to head towards where the noises were coming from. When he was halfway there, suddenly someone's hand grabbed him by the arm. David was frightened by this sudden touch, but when he turned around he saw Nethin's familiar face. "Didn't you take a weapon?" asked the Lord's surprised servant at last. "What? Why do we need weapons? Wait, are they attacking us?" "What? What attack again? We were supposed to train a silly toddler, isn't it?" replied Nethin. "Did you say to me toddler? What do you imagine him thinking?" David was very outraged, and directed to Nethin an angry look. "Come on, my friend, I know what I'm saying. After all, you are small." "Maybe so, but it depends in what sense. After all, I'm not a toddler, I am almost 14 years old. Just because you're a little older than me doesn't mean you have the right to humiliate me. I can see that this adulthood is starting to mess with your head. Why do older people always treat younger people as some inferior race?" David said all the time so quickly that he practically did not take breaths between words. "Okay, well old man, finally take some weapons from your tent." In the end, we will probably not fight and lay down with our bare hands. You yourself are an old man. Wait, what, and what did you say? Are we going to fight each other? Did I understand you correctly? Not really, because we're both going to fight against Selif and not with each other. After all, team members do not fight with each other. Selif? But who is he? The boy became interested. He is such a knight coming from the castle of our lord. He is very popular. People talk about his victories and prowess even abroad. Don't know him? David began to wonder. Maybe he hit something on his ears one day. But no, David had not yet heard of this name. Anyway, he did not pay attention to what others around him were talking about. He also found that all these names from this world are difficult to pronounce and very strange. No, I don't think I've heard about that guy, David finally replied hurriedly to the question. Nathan only nodded affirmatively as a sign that he understood, and then he spurred the boy, so let's fly fast for a weapon. David obediently rushed to his small tent. When he was inside, he saw something that suddenly caught his attention. In the wooden platform, probably serving as a stillage, Nanthornin's sword was placed. I don't think anything will happen if I borrow again, only for a moment this cool sword, said the boy calmly, reaching for a simple weapon. However, it had something beautiful and delightful about it. It was certainly not made of ordinary steel or iron, so David grabbed the hilt and he would pull it out. Unfortunately, the weapon didn't budge. What's going on? Why? He was surprised. After all, the sword should easily stretch out. After a while, David jerked the sword nervously. Weapon finally let go and came out of the piece of wood. Then, in several places, the sword lit up with an unexpectedly bright light. What is this? Squealed David excitedly and at the same time terrified. Suddenly, the light disappeared and gold inscriptions appeared in those places. The assorted boy, who had already more or less grasped the wonders of this mysterious world, approached his eyes to take a closer look. When he did so, he fell to the ground like a long one, which made him fly outside the tent. Sword. He looked at the writing again and said that he really saw the polished letters without a doubt. His eyes did not confuse him and he could clearly see what was writing on the weapon, but the boy thought, or rather wanted to think, that it was quite different. This is some great schizophrenic Melchizedek. It's not possible. It's black magic. It's getting worse here, the boy shouted, but after a while he was suddenly calmed by someone's voice. David, what is happening to you? Why are you lying on the ground? Please calm down and tell me what happened. It was Nathan who began to shake his friend's head, thinking that he had lost all his mind. Look what he writes on this sword. It's in Polish, squealed in response terrified David. David? Do you suffer from something? What were you suffering from? Maybe you tripped and hit your head on the ground, or maybe you've eaten something, maybe some herb. Wait here, I'll go to see a doctor, Nathan said, surprised by the behavior of his comrade. Don't you really see it? Asked David in response, staring insisting at the white blade of the weapon. After a while, he pointed his finger at his friend's short inscription. There is nothing here, David. There are a lot of poisonous, harmful herbs and mushrooms in our forests. Have you eaten one of this filth? Answer. The doctor needs to know what happened. You may even die. I didn't snort anything. I haven't taken anything and haven't been in the woods lately. Look better what he writes here, blindly shouted David. David, this is not funny. I know you ate one of those damned herbs. You're hallucinating. But look at what writes here, you goon. David continued to say indignantly, showing his weapon clearly. David, wake up. There is nothing here. I can't see a single letter on this sword, Nathan assured the young man, shouting straight in his face, hoping that maybe the boy had only predicted something. Suddenly, David burst into tears like a small child. Now he really looked like a toddler who replied in a weak voice. But look what writes Harry. Friend, you'd better go to bed. It's really bad with you. I'll go to the doctor for that time. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll go to exercise today. Selif will probably be not happy with that, he replied, this time in Nathan's calm voice. Chase yourself, you Hazel, growled rudely David in response. What? Am I supposed to chase myself? David, it's really bad with you. How can one chase after oneself? Nathan did not understand the mysterious language of his friend. I'm already rushing for Selnavet's doctor. He should certainly cure you. Wait, breathe calmly. The Lord's servant told the boy, and then ran towards the white tent with a red cross painted on it. When Nathan disappeared into the large tent, David finally rose from the ground and sat down. In that tent he had just heard the cry of a desperate friend. "Dr. Selmfoot, my friend must have eaten some forest herb. Help him, he has some illusions, he sees what he is not there. I fear about his life." David listened to all this and grabbed his head. After all, he saw a clearer inscription on the sword, and in addition in his own native language, "Do not lose faith and overcome evil with good." This was the golden inscription on the weapon. "I have to ask Nankhornin what all this is supposed to mean. I am afraid that I will not be able to stand in this slaty world for a long time," David said quietly to himself.